So today's video is going to be a bit more of an opinion piece, and if you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And we're going to discuss why referencing could be killing your mix. Now, referencing, for anyone that doesn't know, is when you compare your work to the work of someone else's. And typically that's something already commercially released, probably that's been a success and is at a level that you aspire towards. And generally it's your kind of goal to reach the quality of that reference track. Okay, and generally you try to pick reference tracks in the same genre that you're working in. Okay, so references are a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I get plenty of benefit from using references, and it's something that I do pretty much every mix. However, along the way, I kind of made a lot of mistakes referencing, and these are things that I kind of want to help get you on the right track with, because I've ended up chasing my own tail numerous times when mixing, getting frustrated, wanting to pull out my own hair, and that's something that I want to see you avoid. So I've kind of written out several steps of these mistakes that I was making so that you don't do the same. So the first one, and perhaps the most important step, is to make sure that you don't reference too early, okay? And really the crux of this is that a song should trigger an emotional response from a listener, okay? And you need, as a mixer, to serve the song and serve the production. And if you're referencing too early, you can end up focusing on the minutiae too much. So how does my snare sound compare to their snare sound? What sort of frequency balance is in the lead vocal compared to that track? And that's actually quite a bad thing to do, because you're not focusing on what's serving the emotional needs of the song. You're just trying to match something else. And this is the number one reason why I've ended up chasing my tail, is because I hadn't set the scene. I hadn't created a space that was suitable for the song, yet I was already just trying to compare to something that was already finished, and that's something bad to do. So where do I recommend that you do your referencing? Well, I certainly don't recommend that you do it in the prep or the static balance stage, because really you haven't got the blueprint for the mix yet. You haven't made your own decisions on what needs to be done, and you haven't put that into practice. And I've found that if I reference during those phases, that I end up messing things up. I spend hours on things that I should have moved on from quickly, and in general I end up with a worse result. Where I do find referencing important is at least at the end of the kind of static mix stage, where I've kind of got everything into place, okay? And if I possibly can, I'll even leave it till the end of the automation phase. So in general, the whole soundscape and the whole mix has the right sort of emotion and the right sort of journey. And you'd be surprised how quickly during that phase, when you're referencing, how quickly you can actually just whip things into shape with, say, some changes on the mix bus processing or on the overall buses. Within 5 or 10 minutes flicking back and forth, you can kind of get things to where you want it to be, okay? Now, one thing and one caveat I wanted to mention here is that sometimes when I'm mixing in a new room or an environment that I don't know very well, I do actually like to reference material before I even start the mix. And this is less about kind of matching up to a gold standard. It's more about getting my ears and my auditory system used to the environment that I'm working in. So if I'm in a new room or a new environment, or even if I've been to, say, a gig or a nightclub the night before, that can change your perception dramatically of what you should be expecting. And so to kind of reset and get used to a new environment, I actually have a CD of songs that I like to listen to, and I've this morning kind of put that into a playlist form for you all to have a look at. And I'll play many of these tracks on kind of shuffle, and it's a mixture of new tracks, old tracks, some things that I aspire at getting, sonics in that level, and there's some things that are there as a reference to, well, these are older tracks, these are classic tracks. So I've got a bit of everything in there. So if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description, but we've got this Spotify playlist with a bunch of songs. Okay, so that's one thing that I do, but I don't do that while I'm balancing. I don't do that while I'm doing any EQing. I do that literally before I start. So I get into the studio first thing in the morning. Maybe I reply to some emails or have a coffee and chill out for a bit. And during that phase, I'll just casually listen. Okay. So the next problem that I find that people have is they're not using high quality reference tracks. And what I mean by that is maybe they're listening on YouTube or another streaming service, and they're not aware of the fact that those songs are in some sort of compressed format. And I don't mean compressed in terms of dynamic range, okay? I mean compressed in terms of data size. So they've compressed it so that it can be streamed quickly and efficiently, and not really taken the quality into account too much. And so if you're comparing your work to MP3s, that's going to have less overall top end, okay? And you're going to be basically comparing your mix to something that has lost top end. And I've ended up making some mixes too dull time and time again because I've been comparing my work to Spotify or YouTube or other things. Okay, so what I usually prefer to do is to find a lossless file format or a CD and actually rip it and put it in the session. Failing that, you could try and get a Tidal membership. I believe that Tidal now is in a lossless format, so when you're streaming from Tidal, that you're not actually having any data compression occurring, or any compression isn't actually audible. Okay, if you have to use compressed material, I recommend that you get some sort of plugin that allows you to process your audio through that particular codec. Okay, so I've got Isotope's Ozone 8 open here, and you notice in the bottom right corner here we've got a codec option. So let's turn that on and go into its settings. So we can see that we can change the format from MP3 to AAC. Okay, AAC being Mac's own codec. And then we can choose the bitrate. So typically Spotify or other streaming platforms on a high quality mode will be at 320, and in lower modes you might be nearer 128. So if we play this now, we'll be hearing our mix as if it had gone through that MP3 codec.
It's like some kind of animal. It's like some kind of entity.
Okay, and what we can also do is solo the artifacts. So instead of just hearing it turned on and off, we can actually hear what's being lost by going through that data compression. Okay, and let's go to the highest quality of kind of AAC, and you'll notice that the degradation isn't quite so bad. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that if you're forced to reference from MP3 or YouTube or Spotify or something else, make sure that you know the bitrate and you compensate for that, because I've made some mixes too dark because I've been comparing against compressed versions. Okay, so another point is to not reference only one track. When you're referencing, if you're using only one track, you end up kind of copying a little bit too much. Whereas if you're comparing against 3, 4, 5 other commercial releases, particularly if they're in the same genre but different artists and different albums and different mixes, you end up kind of averaging out between them. And that's much healthier than just comparing directly to one song, because sometimes you're still not serving the song if you're just comparing against one track. Okay, so the next point is to level match. Okay, and this is a big problem because when you're referencing, you're comparing your track against something that's already been mastered. So they've kind of put a final level of quality control over the track, and they've brought the level up significantly. So in this particular track, I've got my mix, and I've also got another track that was from this EP. Okay, so this has already been mastered, and you'll see if I play it, I don't need to unmute it, but you'll see how much louder the master is compared to my reference.
It's like some kind of animal.
So you'll see the reference is really, really slammed, okay? It's been mastered, there's not much headroom left, and if I was to flick between them, you would hear a massive volume disparity, so much so that, it would probably blow your ears out a bit. So I'm just, as a matter of course, I'm actually going to turn this track down, a good 8 dBs before I even go back and forth. And then I'm going to volume match by ear, okay?
It's like from
So that can still come down another couple of decibels. Notice I'm doing this with clip gain as well, rather than just with the fader. I usually find that this is just a little bit easier for me, is that quite often when I get through a track, I end up just creeping up the levels as I mix, and that I get a little bit less headroom as I'm nearing the end of my mix. So that can just mean that I can just bring that up, and I'm still in a kind of relatively sensitive part of the fader's resolution. Okay, so let's just keep comparing that, and we're going to volume match.
it's animal, it's like some kind of entity.
And I'm actually going to go to a louder part of the track.
In the spotlight, he lost his temper. For years, I hide myself behind a
So where this track is loud, at this kind of hook and chorus, the other track isn't in a chorus. So quite often I'll like to move it around until I've kind of aligned choruses up. Okay, so I've gone through and aligned kind of 2 loud bits of the song, and I'm just going to compare this again. And, just as well as kind of level matching by ear, you could also use an LUFS meter. So in this case, I've got Isotope Insight loaded up here, and I've got it focused on just the numeric level meters here, okay? And we can just look at the overall level. So I'm just going to refresh this. I'm going to play the original mix first, look at what its integrated level over kind of most of the choruses, flick to the reference, refresh it, and then look at the difference. Okay, so we're pretty much dead on -15. Let's refresh that and let's play the reference. Okay, so we've just gone a little bit too quiet on that, so I'm going to try that a dB and a half or so louder. Okay, so that'll do. That's kind of in the ballpark. So there's also an automatic way of doing this. Meter plugs make a plugin called Perception, which was designed by mastering engineer Ian Shepherd. So if you don't have an LUFS meter already, and maybe you have trouble volume matching, you could try that plugin too. So another thing you can do is to actually reference against yourself or the tracking engineer. So one of the problems that I often found was that I had the need not just to reference against finished commercial releases, but even reference against where I was or the tracking engineer was at the end of recording. And so traditionally, a tracking engineer or producer will print a rough mix for the band or artist to hear and just listen to before it gets mixed. And this will give you a really good idea of the potential balances that the producer and artist intended. And also, the artist will have listened to that a lot, so they'll have gotten used to those balances. And, sometimes along the way during mixing, you might lose a potentially important instrument and ends up getting buried in the mix that they kind of felt was a really prominent part or should be really important. And by flicking quickly towards that rough mix and then back again, you can make sure that you're not missing anything that was good. And you'd be surprised, even when I'm pumping out what I think is a killer mix, when I flick it back to the rough, then you can find things that could be improved. And what hopefully I usually find is that my current mix is way better sonically, but there's just a couple of things that I can fine tune and tweak to make it even better from the rough. And another thing is that get used to printing into the session each version of a track. So every time you do some revisions, literally retitle your Pro Tools session and print it literally in the session here. And we can see if I go into the playlist here, I would usually basically print off every mix, and that would just kind of get put into the playlist, and I can go back to any other variant of the mix along the way. And that means if at mix 1.4, so I've done 3 or 4 revisions to the song, they go, actually we preferred the bass in version 1.2, you can just quickly go in, take this track off input monitor and basically solo that particular version, so you can compare and listen against the bass how you had it there. This can also come in handy when you're doing minor changes. So if they say, I want the vocal in the middle 8 up a bit, then you can put it up and then compare it and go, well, have I done just enough? Because the tendency is that as you get used to listening to something a couple of times, you end up thinking, I haven't done enough. And quite often you'll end up doing too much. So this is just another fail-safe referencing against yourself to make sure that you can just do enough. Okay, so another common problem when referencing, and this is particularly true when you first start out, is that you can hear that there's a considerable difference between your reference tracks and your mix, but you can't exactly pinpoint what's wrong. And a handy way to kind of get over this problem is to concentrate on a different frequency band at a time. And you can do that quite easily with a multi-band compressor. So I've loaded up the Isotope Dynamics module here. And in Ozone 8 here, the bands that they've set these to by default are in very nice positions. And that's, one of the reasons I like this one. And we can really easily, by hitting this S button, just solo the frequencies within that band. So just in this lowest band, we've gone from 0 Hz to 140. And let's go ahead and do the same thing on this reference track. And now we can flick back and forth and kind of work out, what's different about the two. So I kind of feel when flicking back and forth between the two that I just want more energy in the bass guitar down low, so it kind of has more weight and more thickness. Now, it's important that you know both of these tracks that you're doing, because, for instance, in this track, Red Rum, there's a bit more electric guitar than there is in this track, Cartoon Smile. So I can kind of take that into consideration when doing this. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to go into the next band, and I'm just going to basically listen to that in the same sort of way. So again, it feels a little bit thinner in this kind of lower end of that register, and that could again be an arrangement thing and a layering thing, but at least I'm getting an idea of how these tracks are differing. So let's move up again. Okay, because there's like a ride kind of washing over, it kind of feels like the drums are just a little bit more strident in this kind of 1 kilohertz to kind of 4 kilohertz region for me. And because of that, the whole thing just feels just a little bit more fragile and kind of brittle on the mix compared to the reference. Let's move up to the top band. Okay, so that top band kind of felt a little bit denser in the reference, like those sort of frequencies have been compressed just a touch harder. So that's something to bear in mind. So notice that I've gone through this and I've done each band, but I haven't gone through and kind of corrected everything because I'm kind of getting a gist of what's going on. I found through experience that if I just solo the band and immediately start working, sometimes I end up doing too much and I lose perspective of what I'm trying to achieve. And now I've got this in mind, I can go ahead and fix most of these problems at once and do it in the context of the whole track playing. So let's start again from the lower frequencies, and I'm going to put some sort of resonant filter on the low end of the bass. And the idea here being that I'm taking super sub low end away from the bass, but I'm giving it a boost around the kind of corner frequency. And this should kind of make it more punchy and bigger. So that's pretty good, but I just felt like the output had kind of come up a touch too much, so I'm just going to back that down. And now I feel like I almost want to do the same to the kick, but just to not at such an extreme. Maybe I'll focus it around 40 hertz rather than kind of 60-ish area that I did on the bass. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, and I kind of feel like I've got some of the weight in the low mids that I needed from the bass as well, so I'm going to kind of skip that step for now and come back to it if I need to. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of get rid of some of that strident nature on the drums, between 1 and 2K. So I'm just going to do this with a simple EQ. just put a bit more weight in the drums as well.
When I wake up, I put on a face that I apply to highway. I get scared when it starts.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm turning input monitoring on and off so I can kind of hear before and after. Again, this is referencing myself, which is another important step to make sure that you haven't gone too far. So I kind of like that. It's sounding a touch more crushed than I intended now. So I'm just going to back off this parallel here and just see if that kind of cleans it up a bit. So I kind of feel like I just want a little bit more low end overall. So again, let's just go back and compare the two, and let's just kind of balance out the kick and the bass together just a little bit more healthily. So I kind of feel like I got that low end energy that I needed out of the bass now, but it's kind of obscured the kick a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of give some more subby stuff to the kick. Okay, so I'm going to do that with, a plugin by Waves called Max Bass, and what I'm hoping to do is kind of give it that octave above where the low stuff is, so it kind of has the appearance of loads of bottom but without the muddiness. Okay, so that's not really doing what I want it to do, so I'm just going to try achieving this same thing with a sort of harmonic exciter. Okay, so that's doing somewhat of what I wanted. Let's just go ahead and let's put that back in context again. Trying not to keep in solo for too long a period of time on anything. And I feel like all of this has just increased the level just a little bit, and it's kind of hitting into this distortion on the mix bus a little harder. So I'm just going to back this off a touch. Okay, so that's probably enough to give you an impression about how I would go about this refining process and how I can do that with a multi-band compressor. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. And I've also on my website got a free guide on how to get major label sounding vocals. So the link for that is in the description, and I hope to see you again soon.